Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, South Carolina, continuing to work their way through fall camp. And it seems like every practice that goes by, we have a new storyline to talk about. We got a new player that's emerging as a guy we can count on going into 2025. And we're about to get really nitty gritty. We're going to talk about some true freshmen that have the opportunity not only to help this football team right off the bat. It sounds like we got multiple freshmen who are pushing for starting opportunities to start the 2025 year. But I want to start a little bit more overarching before we get nitty gritty. This is really the thing that I think many people are missing about South Carolina going into 2025. When you sit back and listen to the national media talk about South Carolina, they'll reference LaNorris Sellers. They'll reference a guy like Dylan Stewart. You might see them throw in Nick Harvey. You might see them throw in Josiah Thompson. Look, what I think people are missing about South Carolina is, yes, they have high-end difference makers. I mean, South Carolina has some of the best players in the sport on their roster going into 2025. What people are missing is that this is the deepest team that Shane Beamer has had at South Carolina. And when you combine high-end difference makers at premium positions, right? LaNorris Seller at quarterback, Dylan Stewart coming off the edge, Josiah Thompson at tackle. When you combine premium difference makers at positions of importance with a lot of depth, that's how you get a special team. That's how you get a team that plays their best football when it matters most in November. That is the feeling I get from South Carolina going into 2025. Now, we entered fall camp with some depth concerns at certain positions, maybe on the middle of that defensive line. Those depth concerns are quickly working themselves out. We got to talk about some freshmen that are not only pushing to help this team early, but pushing to start in 2025. I'm fired up to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, the South Carolina fans, appreciate you guys, man. The amount of support this fan base has shown the boys, the amount of emails that I get kind of keeping me up to date with some of the nitty gritty happenings of fall camp. I appreciate that stuff more than y'all know. The support means the world. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, a player that we haven't really talked about, and I'll just put my hand up and say that's on me because I got word about Serat making some noise in spring. And it's not like I didn't buy that Serat was making the noise. I just didn't think it was going to be a huge storyline because I didn't see him cracking the starting five. Well, it sounds like that's real going into fall camp. Sounds like that's real going into 2025. Now, before we get into what the starting five would look like with Serat, I want to make this clear. This is not one of those situations where we're just playing a freshman because we have to. Like, go back to 2023 when Tree Babalade started at tackle. Trevon Ball was getting some burn at guard. Those young freshmen were starting out of necessity. They were starting because South Carolina didn't have any other answers on their offensive line, so they had to play freshmen before they were ready. Going into 2025, look, if Serat Jr. emerges as a member of the starting five for South Carolina, that is not because they needed him to play. You have a guy like Nick Sharp. You have a guy like Rodney Newsom, guys that we've seen play quality football at the collegiate ranks. It's not coming from we need to start him out of necessity. It's because this kid's too damn good to keep off the football field. Now, Serat Jr., I mean, this kid, he's a butt kicker, man. He's a roger. He's a bulldozer. This is a guy that, to me, does not lack any physicality to play in the SEC. Where does he slide in on South Carolina's offensive line? Well, it sounds like he's going to start his career at guard. Now, what would that look like? We've talked a lot about Tree Babalade starting at guard going into 2025. Well, it sounds like with Kason Henry dealing with some of the injuries that he dealt with in spring, Tree Babalade was quietly working a lot at right tackle, which kind of represented, hey, whoever wants to start at left guard, you can come and get it. And look, Nick Sharp, I think, can play. Like, Serat Jr. is just emerging as a guy that might offer a better version of the front five for South Carolina than a guy like Nick Sharp. And I'll tell you this, I'm a Wake Forest alum, so I've watched a decent amount of Nick Sharp. Nick Sharp's solid. Is he going to be a first-team All-SEC guy for South Carolina? No, probably not. That is a very quality starter in the middle of your offensive line. The fact that Serat is emerging as a guy that can play over Nick Sharp tells me all I need to know about where Shed is as a freshman. Now, when you start looking at this offensive line, the thing that jumps out to you is one, Tree Babaleta at tackle. Now, I'm kind of interested to see what that looks like. Look, Casey Henry, that's another example of like Casey Henry played quality football for South Carolina towards the back half of 2024. It wasn't great to start, but I thought it was pretty dang solid in the back half. If you're telling me Tree might be a better option at tackle than Casey Henry, gives me a lot of confidence that Tree can make it work at tackle. If this ends up being your starting five, of which it very well could be, you're looking at a physically imposing offensive line. Josiah Thompson at 310 pounds would be comfortably the smallest offensive lineman in this group. I mean, Shed Surratt's pushing 340. Boaz Stanley's 325, and man, he is built like a house. Trevon Boss 335, Tree Babaleta's 335. This might be the biggest offensive lineman in the SEC. Now, it's not only about size. Like, we got to know these guys can play. The thing that stands out is look how deep this football team is. We got guys that are, we think, really solid football players. Case and Henry, Rodney Newsom, Nick Sharp. They're in the two deep. Like, it's a really big offensive line. And it's, I think, an offensive line that can play. I think this is going to be comfortably, I should say this. It has the opportunity from a talent standpoint to be the best offensive lineman or offensive line unit that Shane Beamer has had at South Carolina. We've seen some really bad units in years past. This one, I think, can be really dang good, and it's a product of recruiting the position really well. I mean, you've stacked a lot of blue chip talent. You've supplemented it with some solid transfer portal additions. From a personnel standpoint, this unit looks the part. And then we start looking at, hey, how does South Carolina take that next step on offense? Well, if this offensive line can be better in pass protection, limit the amount of negative plays that South Carolina has seen over the last couple of years, inherently going to take a step in the right direction. Man, I know there are a lot of South Carolina fans that are kind of in the mode of, hey, I got to see it before I believe it. And I get that because we've seen some bad offensive line play. This could be meaningfully better than what we've seen over the last couple of years. And that should excite a lot of South Carolina fans. And it is such a big group. I mean, they got to average close to 330 pounds of average weight on this unit. It's a big, big unit. And we know South Carolina wants to run the football. Number two storyline, a couple of freshmen that we haven't talked enough about. Brian Rowe, Malik Clark, they were and still have been. It's not like Brian Rowe and Malik Clark have just stopped being good football players. They're still turning heads in fall camp. Donovan Murf, who was a guy that was not on campus in the spring, and Jaden Sellers. What I want to focus on with this conversation is they provide skill sets that South Carolina desperately needs in 2025. I mean, you look at the wide receiver room last year, wasn't that good. We've talked about it plenty. Jaden Sellers, yards after the catch. South Carolina didn't really have that difference maker after the catch last year, a guy that you can just get the football to in space, let them do the rest. Like Brian Romo and Jaden Sellers, they seemingly represent that skill set. Then I look at Donovan Murf and say, I know he's a reclassified kid, and I know he wasn't an early enrollee. He is a young guy that we're not sure what to expect from. Go back and look at the high school film. One of the most polished and multi-dimensional wide receivers that we saw in the class. This guy can separate at all three levels. He can be a big body that can be a possession receiver. He can be a guy that can separate when you need him to. South Carolina didn't totally have that last year. Nick Carber kind of emerged as that dude late, but for the majority of the season last year, Nick Carber was still just a big track athlete that was kind of putting on a football helmet. Now, we hope Nick Carber takes that step, but I think Donovan Murf can provide another wide receiver that gives you that multi-dimensional skill set, wide receiver that can attack all three levels. Again, we are looking for we got a lot of wide receivers that can play. And I think what excites me the most is we got a lot of wide receivers that can play that offer different kind of skill sets to this offense. Now, going to the defensive side of the football, what I want to buzz real quick is, some freshmen on the defensive line we haven't talked about, Christian Ingram and Caleb Williams. Can they crack the rotation at some point for South Carolina? Now, what I think is important with this conversation is, look, are we going to see Christian Ingram and Caleb Williams play a ton against Virginia Tech week one? No, probably not. Can they become guys that we trust to play in the middle of October, or maybe even in late October going into early November. Why I think that's so important is, look, I look at this South Carolina football team and say, we got a gettable schedule to start 2025. I think there's a really good chance South Carolina is going into the month of October undefeated. For South Carolina, it's about becoming the best version late in the season when it matters most, when you have those games that are going to be inherently do or die to make the college football playoffs. By that time in the season, is one of Christian Ingram or Caleb Williams, two guys that physically looked apart. If you look at them at the fall camp practice field, are they going to be ready to be guys? We don't need 50 snaps from them, but can they give us 15 to 20? I don't know. I think you can say the same thing with Xavier and Hardy, who is apparently like the highest ceiling out of any defensive lineman South Carolina has. Probably say the same thing for Devontae Miles too. Troy Pikes as a redshirt sophomore. We want them to be ready as early as possible. But I'll look at it and say, hey, I want these guys. Can they be ready in the middle of October when it's time to, hey, we got to win these football games to go out and make the college football playoffs? Last storyline here, and again, it just speaks to the depth of this football team. Vicari Swain, how do we get this kid on the football field? I think we're pretty comfortable that, Jalen Kilgore at nickel, Judge and Brandon Cisse on the boundary. That's probably what the starting unit's going to look like. Vicari Swain's going to be a hard guy to keep off the football field from what we've heard in fall camp. This is a guy that wasn't on the football field in spring, academic issues. He's a guy that we got to figure out how to get on the football field. I'll once again kind of reference, hey, does Jalen Kilgore move back to safety? Does Brandon kind of kick in the nickel? And then Vicari Swain can start on one of the boundary cornerback spots. If he becomes a guy that we have to get on the football field, well, you can get creative. And that's part of the benefit of having a guy like Jalen Kilgore, who I believe is one of the best defensive backs in the conference. Can do a lot of different things with him. Help get your best football players on the field. It's a deep team that has a lot of versatility. And South Carolina is finally in a spot where it's like, how do we get all our good football players on the field? In the past couple of years for South Carolina, they've had some good football players. No question about that. They've won a lot of football games. They didn't have the depth that they have this year. I don't think they had very many conversations of, hey, Vicari Swain can't start a boundary cornerback because we got two really good football players above him. How do we get him on the football field? Those were conversations that South Carolina didn't have the last couple of years. Now they're having it. Super exciting storylines from fall camp emerging. Like, to me, it's what does this starting five look like on the offensive line? I don't think people appreciate how good this unit can be. And if South Carolina takes a step on the offensive line, stop taking as many negative plays, I mean, golly, that is how this offense takes a really big step. And again, I'm kind of sitting here pretty confident. The defense should be solid. I don't know if it'll be as good as it was last year. It shouldn't take as big of a step back as maybe some of us were fearing back in the winter. We got a lot to talk about, a lot to learn about this football team over the next couple of weeks, and obviously monster game week 1 against Virginia Tech. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.